You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. And welcome back, everyone. I have a special guest with me here today, Jana.
Hello.
Jana is usually on the back end of the podcast doing all of the editing, so she is responsible for making what I say sound good. Most importantly, responsible for the rants with Colin that have become so popular on the podcast, so you have her to thank for that. Jana is here today because we have a very special episode. We have actually made it all the way through our Genesis 1 through 6 series. Can you believe that?
Nope.
That came pretty quickly. We have covered a lot of territory, and before we move on into anything else, we wanted to do a question and response episode. So a little bit of background on this and what happened. We had a get-together a couple of weeks ago with some friends who listened to the podcast and have given some feedback, and we wanted to give them a chance to do some question and response with us. We had a great idea where we were going to record the session and just have essentially a live recorded Q&R that we put up as the podcast episode. But as tends to be the case, technical difficulties, the audio didn't quite come through as well as we were hoping for. We were able to get, about 2, almost 3 hours that we were just talking through a bunch of different questions. So we have a handful of questions from that, I think about 6, that we just kind of combined the main stuff that a lot of people were asking. And we wanted to be able to share those here because this isn't just a podcast for one point of view or for one person to talk. I want to be able to have a conversation as much as I can with listeners where you're able to ask questions and we give response. Now, we very specifically call this Q&R. I know a lot of people would say Q&A with a question and answer. But I'd take a page from Bible Project here and a couple other people where they say, I don't want to be seen as the one giving an answer, for any given topic. I can give a response, but there are multiple good answers. So we call it question and response. Jana is here to be the voice of you, asking the questions and giving a little bit of feedback as we go here.
Alright, so the first question we have is, if the giants were the offspring of the sons of God, and there were giants after the flood too, does that mean Goliath was connected to the Nephilim? And if so, could there be Nephilim still today?
That is a fantastic question, really two, so I'll deal with them side by side. I wanted to get into this a little bit more. We just had a couple of really long episodes and it had to get cut out of what we were doing with Genesis 6. But this is something I'm sure we'll get to again in the future. Because the Nephilim do show up, not just before the flood, but also after, and there's no real reasoning or rationale given for it. But the giants in the Bible are always connected back to these Nephilim and these fallen sons of God. So that does mean that Goliath, any of the giants you have in the book of Judges or in 1 Samuel, they are connected to the Nephilim and the fallen sons of God. How exactly? It's never specifically said, but that goes back to when we were talking about that in our Worldview of Genesis 6 episode. David was being presented in 1 Samuel as the seed of the woman who destroys the seed of the serpent. And that's why he is pictured as fighting against the giants of the Philistines, and particularly Goliath. So yes, absolutely, very astute question there. And then the second part of it, asking if there could still be Nephilim today. That is a legitimate question. The TLDR short answer is no. 1 Samuel wants to present to you the idea that David completely wiped them out in his time. That after David's reign, there were no more giants, no more Nephilim in the earth. He destroyed them all. Where they do come back into play, actually, in the Bible, and this is so fascinating, this has to be a totally different episode some other time, but think with me for a second here. As far as we know, you can't kill a supernatural being, but you can kill a human. If you kill a human, body dies, spirit goes to the afterlife. What happens if you kill a supernatural being? We don't know, and we're not even sure you can. So what happens when you have this half-human, half-supernatural creature? You can kill its body. What happens to its spirit? It's not like it's going to heaven or hell. And I think the implication is that they become the demons that Jesus casts out in his ministry. It's an entirely other topic we have to cover sometime when we get into the Gospels. But I think the Bible is telegraphing that the demons in Jesus' day were actually the spirits of the dead Nephilim from the time of Noah and David. So, long story short, no. The Nephilim are wiped out several thousand years ago, and if you run into anyone today saying they are still around, that's not going to be great theology, and you should probably run from whatever website you found that on. Good questions.
Our second question is, many Christians see the world and people as inherently bad, but you said the world and even people are still good in God's eyes. Can you explain that some more?
Yeah, this is getting into some more philosophical stuff. Like, a lot of the questions we had here, they were actually pretty philosophical, weren't they?
Yeah, they were more on, I've heard this in church, and how do you respond to that?
Right, more the application of just a different worldview of dealing with the Bible. So yeah, this is a good question, and one that people have been fighting over for thousands of years now, so I don't expect to give a once-for-all answer in the podcast here. But the person who asked this was right. A lot of Christians, a lot of churches will say you are inherently bad. You come out of the womb a sinner, and you're just basically a horrible person apart from God. But what we talked about is that at the end of every day of Genesis 1, aside from whatever day it didn't have the declaration of good, day 2, if I remember right, didn't have God saying anything was good. But aside from that, every day of creation has God saying it was good, it was good, it was good, and then it was very good. And that extends to humanity as well. Now, we are also told that humans were created as the images of God. I don't know many Christians, in fact, I don't think I know any Christians, who would say that humans today, post-failure, aren't the image of God. They would say, even after that, we are still the image of God. If that carried over, I think the goodness of creation did as well. Nothing in the Bible says that creation stopped being good just because we failed in the garden. I think a lot of people just assume that because they think the garden was perfect. And if it was perfect, well, we're obviously no longer in a perfect world. But what we talked about is that the garden actually wasn't perfect, it just had a lot of potential. And it was a good place. But I think that goodness has carried on even past our failure in the garden. This is the traditional Jewish view of these passages, that God created us good, even post-failure. We, as human beings, are created good. But we can tarnish that goodness in us as we go. It's kind of like in counseling. I do some counseling as a therapist. And one thing that I could do if someone comes to me with a problem is I could just right off the bat say, here's your issue, here's how you fix it. And that's simple, but it's actually not the best way to counsel. You want to be able to draw out from the person what they're thinking about, where all this came from. And a lot of times what you find is that they already know the answer. They already know what they need to change. They just need someone else to draw that out of them and have that said out loud. So I think it's kind of the same thing. We have an inherent goodness that as the longer we live, the more we tend to tarnish it by selfish decisions. The story of Genesis 3, 4, and 6 is that humanity progressively gets worse if we don't intentionally choose God's way. So we get more tarnished in our goodness as we go on. And then the way of God, the way of Jesus, is to polish back the goodness that was inside us there. And so even after a person gets saved, even after a person is a Christian, it's not like their bent for wrongdoing goes away, right? You think about Paul's statement where he says that the good things I would do, I don't do. The stuff that I don't want to do is what I actually do. We all have a good and a bad nature that kind of fight back and forth between us, and that doesn't change after salvation. But I think the focus of the Bible is that humanity was created good and that Jesus allows us to get back to the way that we were supposed to be. Telling you how bad you are doesn't actually fit the message of God. And I understand there are parts of the Bible that focus on the pervasiveness of human sin. We should acknowledge that. We shouldn't ignore that. But we also have to admit that the main emphasis is on the goodness that God created us with.
And I think that a good reason to not focus so much on how awful and bad a person is because a lot of times the inner dialogue that goes on with, honestly, a lot of people is just, I'm terrible, I'm horrible. You feel this cycle of, I should have done this better, or I could have, said this phrase to this person better. And when you have a religious circle that you're in that just tells you that, it doesn't help your mental well-being at all.
Yeah, and that is the message of a lot of religion, is about how bad you are, how distant you are from God. I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but Jana, you will remember this. We went to college together, and when we were there was chapel that we had to sit in every school day, Monday through Friday. And one time a guy came in and preached a chapel service about how you were all cockroaches in God's sight. and basically just how much God despised you if not for Jesus. But that is where a lot of religion focuses. I mean, think about the most popular hymn in all of Christianity. What would you say that is, Jana?
Amazing Grace.
Right. And what's the very opening line? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved
a wretch like me.
Right? So it's right there in our most popular theology that you are a horrible person. And it's very popular in Calvinistic theology. And most of the people who wrote our hymns that have been sung for the last several hundred years had a Calvinist bent. The King James translators had a Calvinist bent. A lot of popular preachers have a major Calvinist bent. So this theology just keeps continuing on when it's like 10% of the story of the Bible, and it's being presented as if it was 100%. But think about this too. Even if you do believe that humans are inherently bad, they just start off bad from birth, you have to wrestle with how a baby can be considered okay before God, before the quote-unquote age of accountability. Because most people would say if a baby died before a certain age, they would go to heaven no matter what. Well, if you still consider that baby to be an awful, rotten sinner, how is that okay for the baby to go to heaven if it dies before an age of accountability? You have to say that God makes some sort of an exception that isn't in the Bible. I think you're forced to jump through all sorts of hoops when the easier answer is maybe we start out okay, and it's just over time we tarnish further and further away from God, and the message of Jesus is actually to get us back to an Eden-like relationship with Him.
All right, our third question that we have. If people are still good, what does it mean when Paul said we were enemies of God?
So this is definitely feeding off of the last one, and it's referencing a passage in Romans 5. Romans is a very difficult book, so if you are basing an entire position off of Romans, there's probably someone else who has a very different view of the same passage that you're using as a proof text. So we have to keep that in mind and hold with an open hand our views as we approach this text. Romans 5, Paul is using metaphors to talk about what life was like before he became a Christian. And so picking up in verse 6, he says, "For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man would a person die, yet for a good man some would even dare to die. But God showed his love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being now justified by his blood, we will be saved from wrath through him. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, being reconciled, we will be saved to life." So he has three different metaphors he uses here. One of being sick and needing a doctor. That's where it says we were without strength. That means when we were sick, Christ died for us. Of being sinful, God showed his love toward us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. And then also being hostile. That's what the word for enemies there means. It means someone who is hostile to God. And that's what Paul was in his life. He was hostile to the Christian way before his Damascus Road experience. But I have to point out that enemies does not mean horrible people. Notice what he does not say. When we were horrible people, God reconciled us through the death of his Son. It says for when we were enemies. Enemies, that word can mean someone who has been alienated from God. And I think that definition actually fits really well here. Because if you are alienated from someone, it implies that you already had a relationship there. You can't be alienated from something that you didn't already have a connection to. So I think that actually fits this view well. And when you think about it, enemies of God don't have to be people who aren't saved. There are plenty of people, even in churches, who act that way. The idea of being the enemy of God isn't about being a horrible person. It's about the realm that you were in before becoming a Christian. Roman mythology, Paul's writing to Romans, so he's using that. Roman mythology had adapted much of Greek mythology. The Greeks had a belief that the afterworld was a place called Hades. That's where everyone went after you died. Good and bad. And that shows up even today in some cartoons or comic books. I think the Hercules Disney movie had Hades and plenty of different comic books as well. So the Romans had a very similar idea. They just called it Pluto instead of Hades. And yes, Pluto, like the planet, Pluto is still a planet as far as I am concerned. I'm a millennial. Roman mythology had a realm of the dead, and you have someone who's basically like a lord of the dead. Or in a lot of Canaanite mythology, that would have been Baal or Baal. So basically translated over into Satan. The idea of this ruler of the underworld. You are in his realm because, well, you're going there eventually. All humans die. So in a way, it's like you owe a debt to that. You're in the kingdom of death. But then because Jesus was able to raise from the dead, he conquered death, it's a whole new kingdom. So by saying when we were enemies, we became reconciled, he's not saying when we were horrible people, God saved us. He's saying when we were under the rulership of death and hell, God stepped in and brought us to his side of it. It is a difficult, nuanced topic, but I think it does still fit with the view that humanity is inherently good and can just lose its way, and that's what we need God and Jesus for.
Our fourth question that we have, in the 7th episode, where you called Eve the first fundamentalist, you talked about there being a difference between what the Bible says and what we were taught the Bible says. How can you tell that difference, and how can we learn new ways without going too far?
I really appreciate this because it fits kind of my story as well. I grew up in a fundamentalist church.
I grew up in a way more fundamentalist church than you did.
Well, yes, that is true. But it's been a journey, really, for both of us, as we have been trying to let the Bible
speak for itself.
Yes, instead of all of the culture that we had surrounding it that spoke louder and said, this is what the Bible means. It can be really, really hard. When you are in any given circle, you tend to only hear the things that those people in that circle say. And so it can make it sound like this is what everyone believes. If you're conservative politically and you listen to Fox News or any red-leaning news, you're going to think that all sane people think that way because, well, that's what you hear in the news. If you're more left-leaning, you only listen to CNN or whatever, you're going to think that's what rational people listen to. You have to be able to break outside of the standard avenues of information in your circle. That is the best way I have found to be able to tell a difference, is you have to listen to other people. The best thing that helped us is when we went to college, I think. Because when you're in college, you learn very quickly the things that you thought were normal that ain't normal. And this might be a dumb illustration, but I think it gets the point across. If you have a household that is just all guys, single dad or what have you, and maybe a couple of sons, but no girls, no wife, and whatever, the kid may think it's normal to leave a toilet seat up all the time. If he starts to date a girl eventually, he's going to find out real fast that doesn't fly outside of his house. But it just seems normal because that's all you know in that context. So it can be basically an echo chamber, and the only way you can get out of that is by listening to other people. Now, just because someone says something doesn't mean that you have to accept it. I think that's important because a lot of circles, especially the conservative ones, are going to say, don't listen to people outside of our circle. It's dangerous, they're going to lead you astray. Well, I would just challenge you, if your view is so fragile that even just hearing a different view will convince you to leave yours for that one, maybe it wasn't worth holding in the first place. Ultimately, information is not the enemy of the truth. Information is a good thing. And it is only by having all of the available information, or more of it than just what one side tells you, that you're able to make an informed, discerning decision on any given topic. You have to be able to separate the authority of the Bible from your view, or else you're going to be faced with a decision at some point where either your faith crumbles or you decide to dig your heels in and just stick your head in the sand and pretend like you didn't hear a different view. And that's not good. So we have to be able to say there's a difference between what the Bible says and what I think it says.
And a lot of times, digging your heels in results from something that someone in your life did, and you have to make the decision, is my position more important than my relationship with this person?
Yeah, and that can be really, really tough. That's hard when you start to consider different positions and other people in your life aren't at that stage. The problem that arises is that a lot of churches are based around having the exact or very, very similar set of beliefs. And I get people who think the same group together. It's just natural. But if you make membership in your group being about you have to believe really similar to me, your group's going to be pretty small. Because most people in the world don't think like you, or me. We're all individuals. That's what makes us unique. We all think differently. And I think that's why so many churches are so small. Because they have said, you have to believe this entire statement of faith to be a part of us. Well, most people don't think like that. And so you end up dividing over people having a different opinion than you. Not everything is a dividing issue. And so kind of circling back to the last part of that question there, how can we learn these new ways without going too far? Personally, I don't think there is such a thing as learning too much or having too much information. The problem is what you do with it. And I know, coming from a very conservative, fundamentalist Christian background, we were constantly told about the slippery slope, right? If you start to listen to this type of music, or watch this type of movie, or read this type of Christian book, it's going to start you on a trend just where you're falling off the edge of the cliff. The problem is, people only ever talked about the slippery slope as if it was only on the left side. But if you've ever been on a mountain, they have two sides, and you can fall down either one of them. There's a slippery slope, quote-unquote, if you will, both on the left and the right side of any issue. You can go too far either way, and so yanking someone as far away from the edge as possible may actually just be putting them on a different edge on the other side. So I don't think we should be afraid of hearing different views. I think that actually gives us discernment to think for ourselves, instead of just how we were always told.
Our fifth question is, in a couple episodes, you mentioned that God may have worked through evolution and seemed to favor that view. Can you talk a little bit more about why?
I'm not sure if I would say I favor that view or not. I grew up with the idea that creation had to be 6 24-hour days, basically the Ken Ham style, and anything else you were doubting God and probably hated the Bible and kicked puppies. You were a horrible person who couldn't be a Christian. The more I've studied this, the more I'm intrigued by the idea that evolution could fit into the text. Several good Christians throughout the past couple hundred years have believed that. I'm not entirely sure where I land on it. I'm pretty convinced that the ancients weren't thinking of 6 24-hour days, but I'm also pretty convinced that they didn't have Darwin's theory of evolution in mind back then either. So I think that we have to remember that this is an ancient document that was not written to answer our questions. When the authors of Genesis were putting all this together, they weren't thinking about Ken Ham and Bill Nye doing a debate in the 2010s or whenever that happened. They were trying to tell their own story. Some people do look at the text and they see in there 6 24-hour days. Others see a possibility for evolution. Either way, we have to admit that it is our own man-made scientific ideas that we are importing onto this. The Bible is not a science textbook, and it was not trying to say, here is the exact manner in which the world was created. It was trying to prove a theological point, and it used the language of Genesis 1 and 2 to do that. I think you can fit either in, depending on which way you want to look at it. You can look at some things and think, this sounds like 6 24-hour days. But then some questions show up that just don't quite fit with that view. Like day being used to refer to the entire week. It doesn't have to be 24 hours there. Create not having to mean that God created out of nothing in those verses. We talked about some of those in the first few episodes. Then you get where did water come from? Story begins, in the beginning God created the skies and the land, the heavens and the earth. The earth was tohu vavohu, wild and waste, and darkness was over the face of the earth. So there's nothing that says God created the water. Where did it come from? Well, the text isn't interested in telling us. It's just there, pre-existent. You have questions like, who was Cain afraid of after he killed Abel? He said, everyone who finds me will kill me. Well, if it was just him and his 2 parents, why didn't he say, I'm afraid my parents will kill me for this? Or even if he had some cousins or other brothers and sisters at the time. It just doesn't seem to fit. There seem to be more people there. Things like light existing before the sun, and days even existing before the sun. The sun wasn't even created until, I think, day 4 in the creation week, if I remember correctly. And so you have light and you have days. How could you have 24-hour days if the 24-hour days are based on the movement of the sun? So you have all these different questions that come up, and some people look at those things and say, well, nothing in the text specifically says how much time went by. I think in order to have a Christian view of the text, you have to believe that God had some hand in creating. Whatever that looked like is open to debate, but God had something to do with it. So this is not kind of the stereotypical atheist evolution where it's just Big Bang, everything evolves on its own. God does have some hand in it, and especially in the making of Adam and Eve, but how exactly that happened isn't fully specified. A lot of people base their faith and their idea of the power of God in one modern way of viewing the Bible. But according to the Bible, being a Christian means that you believe in Jesus. That's really what it comes down to. To be a Christian, you have to think that there was something about this Jesus of Nazareth that changed the world. Anything else, you've got a different religion, but Jesus has to be somehow central to it. Everything else, we can disagree on. You can believe in evolution and still be a Christian. And it's fine if you want to say that you have to hold to the Bible to be a Christian. But you can't claim that your interpretation of the Bible is what I'm supposed to believe. It's just your interpretation. For most of human history, we thought very differently. We thought very abstractly. But since the time of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we've changed to a very concrete way of thinking that can butcher ancient texts. We have to remember that they aren't written like our modern books are. And ultimately, I think Rachel Held Evans worded it best when she said that the Bible is meant to be a conversation starter rather than a conversation ender. For a lot of Jewish people, and even for some Christians, the Bible is how you start a conversation. You say, oh, I think this about an issue or about a passage. Oh, that's really interesting. Here's what I think about it. But then there are several Christians that treat it like a conversation ender. Here's my proof text that shows I am right. If you don't automatically agree I'm right, well, we're done. Treat the Bible like a conversation starter rather than a conversation ender. And realize that people can be good Christians and still believe differently about these topics. So I'm not necessarily going to say I am 100% convinced that God worked through evolution. But I think that he does give wisdom to humans through our scientific studies to understand better the way that the world works. And I think that since the Bible is not a science textbook and it's not a modern book, it's an ancient one that was trying to tell a theological point, we can bring our human ideas of how the world works to it, and we don't have to consider them to be on equal footing with the Bible. Our idea of how the world works changes over time, and that's okay. We have to let the Bible be its own thing. And how we understand it across time may differ, but it is telling its own story, and we have to respect that. Okay, what did we cover there? About 5 questions?
Yes.
I think. So that was the majority of what we talked about in our Q&R session. If you have questions like this that you would like to have featured on the podcast, you can email us. You can do that on the website. You can also email directly to cconn, CCONN, at thebibleuncut.com. And you can interact with our social media posts as well. If we said something in one of the episodes that got you thinking or you have questions, you can put them up there. And we would love to keep doing this. I would love to be able to have several more question and response, at least one per main series that we do. I think would be really fun. Feel free to send those in. We have some exciting news coming up here with the podcast. We have officially now finished our Genesis 1 through 6 series, so congratulations for listening through that. We have a mini-series that is going to be coming up here. We're going to take a 1-week break. So after this episode, there will be none next Sunday as we're transitioning our series. But then we're going to have a mini-series of 2 episodes talking about horror and the Bible. So we have Halloween coming up here at the end of the month. And I know that means a lot of things to a lot of different Christians. But we want to be able to cover a biblical angle of this, and what is a biblical position on horror specifically, and what can we learn from that. So we're going to have a couple really unique episodes that I think will provide a view that you've probably never heard in church before. Really, really interesting stuff. I've been putting all kinds of study into that. I think it's going to be great. And then once November hits, we will pick up again with Genesis. We'll be in Genesis 7, doing 7 through 11. Thanks for listening. Jana, thank you for being a part of this. It was good having you on today. And you want to close us out?
Stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.